podcasts.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Well, good afternoon and welcome along to The Profile with me, Justin Brierley. This is the programme where we sit down with leading Christians in all walks of life to talk about their faith journey and what they've been doing. We're going to be talking today to Nigel Cameron, very exciting guest joining me. I'll be introducing him in just a moment's time. But this programme, as ever, brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine. If you'd like to read more interviews with leading Christians, do go there and ask for a free sample copy. premierchristianity.com/free sample. And don't forget, you can find The Profile on its own profile podcast. Find that at our website, premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. So my guest today is Nigel Cameron, bioethics and future technology expert. He's held numerous academic positions, currently serves as president of the Centre for Policy on Emerging Technologies in Washington, D.C. He's a Christian and the author of a new book called The Robots Are Coming, Us, Them and God, published by CARE, where he assesses the possibilities and challenges afforded by robotics and the advances of artificial intelligence. Nigel, welcome along to the programme.
Great to be here.
It's great to have you on. We always start at the beginning with the profile. So before we get on to the future of robotics, let's go back to the past of Nigel Cameron. Did you grow up in a Christian family yourself?
I think the answer would be not really. I grew up in the 1950s when things were still pretty formal and children were sent to Sunday school by their parents who generally didn't bother going. And my family was that kind of family.
And do you get sent to Sunday school then?
Oh, yes, we did.
Did it make any impact on you?
I was baptised as an Anglican baby and then sent to Methodist Sunday schools, and I rather enjoyed myself in terms of faith. I think the answer would be no, but these were certainly fun times with nice, well-meaning people.
When did Christian faith come alive for you then?
Well, like so many of us in my teens, I began to think about things somewhat more existentially, It's quite interesting. I remember when I was at school, I was at grammar school, I remember one very striking Whitsuntide. We sang the hymn, Come Down, O Love Divine. And I remember thinking, I was probably 15, 16, that something had happened to me since last Whitsun, when I last sang the hymn. So this was not the standard, 3:31 on a Friday afternoon conversion experience, but there was a process going on.
Right.
And I was becoming a Presbyterian Christian because I actually was living in Edinburgh. My parents were living in Edinburgh then. And since when I have been a mainline Presbyterian.
What's distinctive about a Presbyterian as opposed to, say, an Anglican or a Baptist or a Methodist?
Well, there are, of course, endless jokes about these things, which we probably haven't got time to go into now. Presbyterians, in many ways, I think there's a middle of the roadness. There's a formality. We tend to like hymns with rhymes and different verses every verse, rather than the kind of modern praise approach. We like formality in worship. We think it's important without going all the way to the more traditional Episcopal and, of course, Catholic approaches. So it's a kind of middle way in worship terms. And I think there's a higher view of the dignity of God and the dignity of the individual within the Reformed tradition, which I am happy to adhere to now many years later.
And obviously very influenced by theologians like Calvin and others in the Reformed movement.
Well, Calvin, of course, Calvin was a much bigger man, as it were, than many of the Calvinists. He was a much more interesting man. And a much broad.
He tends to get reduced
thinker.
A bit into 5 points these days.
He tends to get reduced into 5 points, and
yes.
I think Calvin would have been pretty cross if he were having that conversation. I mean, very much concerned about culture, about government.
I mean, would Calvin today be writing books on robotics and artificial intelligence, do you think?
I think he'd be writing a foreword to mine.
Well, look, obviously faith, did come alive to you through this process. Did you ever consider Christian ministry, specifically in the church?
Oh, yes. Well, I started off planning to be a Presbyterian minister. And, I read theology at Cambridge and then went to Edinburgh and did an MDiv. And spent a year as an assistant minister in Dunblane Cathedral. Dunblane, which of course became famous later for the massacre.
For the tragedy.
I did a weekly assembly in that school gym where they killed those children later. Very strong memories of that. And but then did a PhD. And I was actually quite open to going to pastoral ministry, but I set up a Christian think tank in Edinburgh, and then went to teach in a theological seminary in the States back in the 90s, and spent 8 years there.
So theology and academia called in the end.
It did indeed.
And I suppose in the process you've spoken to and trained a lot of people who have gone into pastoral ministry.
For better or for worse, yes. Some of them keep in touch, But interestingly, alongside all this, back in my teens, before and somewhat after my initial faith experience, I was considering going into politics. British politics. I was going to be Prime Minister. I was quite determined to be. And when I've seen the kind of failures of many people of my generation and younger over the last few years in this role, I rather think maybe I should have. But I was quite committed to a political life. I was going to go to Oxford, do PPE, which is a standard way into British politics, and then shifted and thought, no, I want to go into theology, I want to go into ministry. And looking back on that, I would never advise anyone to think quite how I was thinking then. This was a rather pietistic way of thinking. I didn't have a mentor, didn't really have good advisors. I knew senior Christian people, but they didn't take initiatives. One of the things I've learned dealing with younger people now is I'll just say things to them. I'll say, well, had you thought about that? And isn't this a crazy idea? I'll just chip in.
Right.
I can't do much harm, it seems to me, because most people don't actually get good advice.
Right.
But anyway, I decided instead of going that way. And one thing it's meant is I've had a long-standing interest in policy and in the whole political idea and how Christians should and maybe shouldn't be involved in that process.
Well, we're going to talk about your career in biotechnology and that sort of area in terms of the policy. But the internet, of course, can trawl up all kinds of things these days. And I noticed that some of your earliest books were actually on the whole intersection of creationism and evolution and that sort of thing. What drew you into sort of looking into that early in your Christian academic career, and have your views changed over the years on that issue?
I think my views have mellowed a bit, although I was always somewhat on the fence. I just thought those are rather important issues, and I thought that the kind of arguments being used by a lot of scientists who were Christians to sort of avoid having to address the creation narratives and so on were. I think that they were a bit weaselly. I mean, I think they weren't really facing some of the fundamental questions being raised there about God creating a perfect world and human beings falling and the fall tying in all sorts of evil and so on. And I was somewhat on the fence, but I thought these were important questions. They'd somewhat been relegated, on the one hand, to slightly crazy people, and on the other hand, to people who weren't thinking very seriously because it would interfere with their careers.
Right.
And I think things like the intelligent design movement, which I'm not a total fan of, but I've admired its development. I think it's a much more intellectually serious, culturally serious effort to get back into some of those discussions.
I see. So for you think that there is a place for Christians who are not necessarily tied into the sort of theistic evolutionary way of seeing. Well,
there certainly are Christians like that, but I think it depends partly how you start defining your terms. I mean, part of the point of intelligent design is that basically, if there is a God, then plainly he's God, and he must somehow have masterminded this process, and you can't just sort of pretend it was a matter of chance, even if it may look like chance from our end. And what's, of course, very interesting is that a lot of the top people in science and in philosophy are Christians. And in various different ways, they've come to terms with these problems. Plainly, the old fundamentalist idea that it all happened, 4004 BC and so on. A lot of people still believe that, particularly in the States. It's rather sad that they believed it. I think one of the most interesting things that we've discovered, if you like, since Bible times has been time and the enormous expanses of time which there have been and which perhaps there will be. One of the things I drop into conversations with Christians about technology is used now is, well, how will this look in 1,000 years' time? How will this look in 1 billion years' time? Because God may well be leaving us here for the next 1 billion years to work with these technology issues. This isn't all going to be over tomorrow afternoon.
Absolutely. Well, that's where things began for you. Obviously, you then pressed into the areas of bioethics, human life, technology, and so on. What kind of really led you to, make that your life's work? It's certainly in the first half of your career in the Christian world.
You asked very good questions. Well, a couple of years ago, I have 13 grandchildren. And
congratulations! That's a remarkable number.
It's quite easy to have grandchildren. Having children is more of a problem. And one of my daughters several years ago said, I don't see her children much because they live a long way away. She said, "Well, would you write down some of the stories about your childhood so I can share them with the children?" So I took this rather more seriously than she perhaps intended. And I wrote about 60,000, 70,000 words and published it on Amazon, and it's out there now. And I hope sales will now pick up after this conversation. But it took me back into my childhood in all sorts of interesting ways. And I began to explore, how I put pieces together as a child And one thing I was reminded of, which I'd completely forgotten, was when I was at school. I mean, I was doing economics and history and that kind of thing. I actually was given the prize for the science prize for arts forms, which astonishes me. I have no memory of how this happened. But plainly, I've had this long-standing interest in science technology questions.
Yes.
And then, of course, all of a sudden, bioethics sort of breaks on the world with new technology issues, with in vitro, with cloning, and those sort of issues in the 80s and the 90s. And surprise, surprise, hardly any Christians seem to be interested in responding.
Right.
And so I decided, well, let's do some things about this. So I set up a magazine called Ethics and Medicine back in 1983, which is quite a long time ago. It's still going strong, or still going weak, but it's still going.
Yes.
And organising conferences about the Warnock Report, which was the big defining report on in vitro technology. And this just kind of pulled me into all sorts of conversations I didn't know much about, but it meant I got interested and began learning something.
And you learned very quickly, I'm sure, along the way. And in a sense, because Christians weren't really stepping up to engage with these big cultural scientific issues, you felt obliged to, at some level, maintain some kind of a Christian perspective in these.
Well, I think, in the fallen world, that little sort of French phrase, faute de mieux, for lack of anything better or anyone better, sometimes you just have to step in, and your ignorance is something which turns into a certain amount of knowledge and wisdom as time goes by.
And your work in sort of looking at policy in these areas in the UK has often been in conjunction with CARE, who obviously are interested in these sorts of bioethical issues. And over in the US, you've sort of been involved with a number of different foundations. And by and large, when you started, you say in the 80s and 90s, it was issues around cloning and just people were just getting going really with manipulating DNA and chromosomes and so on, in vitro fertilization. Today, we're looking at the possibility of 3-parent children. We've got all kinds of gene editing capabilities. Things are just continuing to progress. Are Christians any more engaged than they were when you began?
Well, it's a sad thing. I mean, I've thought a bit about this recently, looking back, and I think the answer is no. And in proportionate terms, given the significance of the questions, I mean, maybe even less. Because, of course, the issues keep just burgeoning. And we had all the biology stuff going, 20, 30 years ago now with in vitro and cloning, and now 3-parent babies coming out of that conversation. Now, of course, we have all this AI robotic stuff. And, when did you last sort of, hear a sermon from your vicar, from your pastor on anything to do with these subjects? And it is an extraordinary thing. It's as if the church is basically backing up into a situation every year less engaged in the contemporary world than it was in last year.
So where do you find yourself personally when it comes to some of these issues? Obviously, each one of them is nuanced and would require a whole interview in itself. But to pick on one, for instance, let's talk about 3-parent children. Now, this is new technology that has been now made legal in the UK and in other countries, whereby parents who expect to pass on some kind of genetic disease to their children could see that not happen by introducing extra DNA from a third party. Many will say, fantastic, wonderful advance in technology. Christians should be supporting that kind of an issue. Okay, what are the not so great aspects of that as far as you're concerned, and how do you balance those two?
I suppose my thinking on these sort of issues, and I mean, and you can go back to the artificial insemination and donor gametes and so on from a generation ago as sort of prefiguring this discussion. I suppose I'm a little less of a mind that we should ban things and heavily regulate them in the way I think I might more naturally have thought 30 years ago.
Okay.
But I remain equally uneasy about these questions. I think people must make decisions in conscience. From time to time, people I know or friends of people I know will come to me and they'll ask for personal advice about these things. I mean, I sat down with a couple, a number of years ago in the States, who were friends of a student I'd been teaching, and they were wrestling with these questions. And we spent hours talking about it and prayed about this. And at the end of the day, I was saying to them, I said, you're going to make up your own mind about it. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I mean, you're not talking here, about something which is obviously wicked and terrible and don't do it. You're talking about a complicated decision. It's
a grey area.
Which you have to live with. And I'm pointing out to you some of the problems you need to surmount if you're going to decide to go that way. And I think that's pretty much how I'd handle 3-parent babies or 4-parent babies or 5-parent babies.
Right.
I mean, people want a baby, they want a healthy baby. And I mean, who could deny that at one level. But what kind of price are we paying to get there? I mean, what people tend to forget, it's amazing how even Christians forget, we're all going to die. I mean, we're mortal, we're frail, diseases out there, mortality. I mean, that nothing is perfect in this life. And the notion, it isn't as if you can create the perfect child who will live forever. And coping with risk, coping with disease, this is all part of the human condition. We're so much better at it than we were 30 years ago, quite apart from 300 years ago, when everyone sort of had, rickets and arthritis and tooth pain all their lives and somehow managed to cope and be happy families and, write music and all the wonderful things people did back then. It's so much easier for us. And I think this pursuit of perfection ultimately we'll never reach perfection. There'll always be diseases and problems and challenges. I think we set ourselves up for failure. But I think it's a matter of conscience, and I certainly have Christian friends who would disagree with me and who've made choices about these technologies that I don't think I would have made, but I was never faced with that choice.
Sure. You've also obviously done a lot of work in the area of beginning of life and end of life issues. So these are both hot button issues very often, perhaps more so even in the US, where they really do have political implications, more so probably than in the UK. Where do you personally stand on the issue of abortion, for instance, and how does that play into what you're doing in a somewhat secular sphere today when it comes to decision-making and policy-making in this area?
Well, I certainly think abortion is a fundamental moral problem, and I think abortion takes a human life. I think there's no question about that. It's a biological fact. I think what the law should do about it is complicated. I don't think even the most enthusiastic pro-life people would say women who have abortion should go to jail for homicide. So I think it's a fuzzy. It's always been a fuzzy area, even if one thinks abortion is fundamentally wrong, and that there's no way around that. What you do in law is a different question. In the States, of course, it's a much more political issue than it is here. I certainly have actually rather good friends who are on the complete other end of this whole discussion in a conscientious way, and I respect them for that. At the same time, I think that if I were faced with a decision, if one of my children, grandchildren, wherever a friend was, I would simply say, well, I couldn't countenance this. I mean, this is taking a human life. On the other hand, it isn't quite the same as taking a human life of a born baby. Peter Singer, interestingly, we were talking about Peter Singer earlier, who's a very interesting man because he's a very liberal bioethics guy who follows arguments in the way that most people won't.
To their logical conclusion.
To their logical conclusion. He's a very useful, he's sort of bookend in these debates. And I mean, he has said, well, yes, he said, I agree. So taking the life of a child in utero is the same thing as taking its life after it's born. He said, what's the problem? I agree with the pro-life people there. Right. And he thinks you should be able to take the life of handicapped babies after they're born.
Yes.
And isn't that an interesting argument? So, I mean, it seems to me that there's a spectrum here. But once human life starts, you're taking a human life. And I think you shouldn't do it.
I suppose the difficulty is when it comes to the real-life decisions about what sort of policy you implement, because many people have argued that simply banning abortion actually increases the risks of obviously backstreet terminations, that sort of thing. And even I understand in the political sphere, there is evidence, some people have posited the idea that under more liberal presidencies in regard to these kinds of issues, the number of abortions has actually fallen against more, if you like, conservative presidencies with more anti-abortion sort of views, where actually the abortion rates go up, and it's more tied into sociological issues than necessarily simply whether the law allows or doesn't allow for abortion.
I think it's very complicated. I think there's been a turning against abortion in American society in the last 20, 30 years, which hasn't had much to do with the pro-life movement. I think younger women particularly are thinking through these things afresh, and the whole issue isn't so politicized as it was. And they're making decisions for themselves. The New York Times ran a series of pieces a few years ago about mothers and daughters, and the mothers were these sort of progressive feminist women, who'd fought all the battles about the right to choose, and their daughters were pushing back and saying, no, this is awful, this is a baby. I think it's important not just to play politics here and let people make conscientious decisions. But certainly it seems to me that abortion is basically an early form of euthanasia, and it's a form of euthanasia which is never voluntary.
And there are, of course, some states in America that have also very much liberalised end-of-life issues, euthanasia in particular. I think in Oregon, for instance, they've for some time had quite liberal views on people being able to terminate their life. And what are the issues, I mean, again, in a nutshell, that are emerging from that? Are we seeing any kind of evidence of good or ill coming from those sorts of places where they have decided to go down that road?
Yes, Oregon took a lead in, what is framed as physician-assisted suicide. Basically, if your doctor helps you to die, the doctor is killing you. Let's not kid ourselves about this. It's basically suicide and homicide at the same time. There haven't been a vast number of cases. The argument's been made that, in fact, this has been quite restricted, and it wasn't, as its foes suggested, everybody was going to start being killed off. And that is true, but nevertheless, it is happening. People are making these decisions. If you want to see how bad it can go, of course, you go to Belgium and you go to the Netherlands, you go to Holland, just over the Channel and North Sea there. And I mean, in the Netherlands, we've had this going now for 25 years, and there are thousands of people regularly killed by doctors. It's a routine part of medical practice. Belgium followed the same way. There was a case just a couple of weeks ago, a woman, I think, in her 30s, and her only medical issue was she was depressed, and the doctor killed her for it. I mean, that's where this has gone. And they've also, of course, in the Netherlands, they've gone after children now, so children can be killed. And, I mean, it's very interesting. The fact that I wrote this book on robots now, the best book I wrote was a book about Hippocrates, which I wrote back about 30 years ago, called The New Medicine, Life and Death After Hippocrates, about the way that the medical tradition was falling apart. And you go back into the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath says no abortion, but it also says no euthanasia. I mean, the Hippocratic doctors were not out killing people. And this set medicine on its course in the whole history of the West. And it was pre-Christian. And this was a sort of Greek philosophical idea that doctors don't go around killing people or helping kill people. And that has dominated medicine really until the 1950s and 60s. Of course, back in Britain with the Abortion Act, all the royal colleges were opposed to liberalising the abortion law. It's changed now. And British medical associations have been traditionally opposed to euthanasia. But medicine was opposed to these things, interestingly, at times when there wasn't much you could do. I mean, really, there's nothing more we can do. Back in the 18th century, it meant there was nothing more we can do, and you could lie there dying of cancer or something for years. Whereas now, we have an awful lot we can do, and at the same time we decide, but we don't want to bother doing it. So you have the hospice movement on the one hand, focused really on the care of those who are dying, an enormously valuable thing. I'm privileged to meet Cicely Saunders and involve her in some events we did years ago, the founder of the modern hospice movement. And at the same time, we have all these pressures to kill people. And the real problem with killing people is it saves money, and it solves problems. If euthanasia cost £500,000, I wouldn't be so worried about it. But euthanasia saves large amounts of money. And given the pressures on our healthcare system, and given the fact that a lot of doctors and a lot of relatives want to get people out of the way because they're a nuisance, we've got to protect the rights of patients. And I think that means protecting their right to live.
Really interesting stuff. I wish we had more time to talk about that, but we must talk about some other issues. We're going to be, in the next section of the programme, really delving into the issue of artificial intelligence and robotics, which is really what you've been looking at in more recent years. What though overall is your view of how Christians should engage with, whether it's these issues on biotechnology, end-of-life issues, or indeed the issues of a lot of people see Christians as having knee-jerk reactions to things, being sort of regressive and that sort of thing, and often science and faith are kind of posited as somehow opposites to each other and all that sort of thing. I mean, I'm guessing you interact, though, at the levels you interact with people of faith, people without faith, and that it's not as simple as sort of Christians are just sort of trying to push back on where society's going all the time.
Well, one doesn't want to be too down on Christians. I mean, we're Christians, and we're all for them, and we all do our best. But I think Christians are intellectually very lazy. I think a typical church is composed of quite smart people, who have all sorts of different sorts of jobs, maybe professional jobs, maybe more rudimentary sort of jobs. But I mean, they do jobs, and these are people who've trained and people who are busy all day, and they go to church and they really want to go back to Sunday school.
Right.
They want it to be easy, and they do not want to be challenged to think, and it means that all the thinking gets done outside. And interestingly, I mean, the sort of the approach of so many pastors is that, well, they want to keep the church basically talking about religion, about matters of faith. They think it would be secularizing the church to talk about robots or talk about, CRISPR gene technology or whatever the issue might be, or even climate or, something, environment issues. And the irony is what's happening is the opposite. Because they won't address these things, people leave the church on Sunday afternoon or whenever the service finishes, and they absorb all their attitudes toward all of these huge contemporary questions from their neighbors, from the magazines they read, from the websites they read, from the radio going to work, and so on. And these are not framed; these approaches are not framed by the Christian faith. And the faster it doesn't matter so much when nothing is changing out there. Maybe in the middle of the 19th century, it didn't really matter very much. And now it matters hugely because these are vast new questions. And it isn't just the church isn't addressing them. The church members of them, the body of Christ, is basically having its approaches shaped by whatever happens to be the hottest thought out there. So we're really moving backwards.
My guest today on The Profile is Nigel Cameron. He's a bioethics and future technology expert. He's held numerous academic positions, currently serving as president of the Center for Policy on Emerging Technologies in Washington, D.C. His latest book is The Robots Are Coming, Us, Them and God, published by CARE. I'm Justin Brierley, speaking to Nigel today here on The Profile. And we'll be back as we look at the issues surrounding technology, artificial intelligence and robotics in the next section of today's edition of The Profile. There's a knife crime epidemic in our capital city. In the February edition of Premier Christianity magazine, meet the inspiring Christians bringing God to the gang leaders in the battle for London. Plus, Kay Warren talks about how her marriage to megachurch leader Rick Warren nearly hit rock bottom and what brought them back again. Sam Hales asks whether evangelicalism can survive in the age of Trump. Where's Sutton on what to do when God doesn't heal? And the amazing account of how Corrie ten Boom's unshakable courage saw thousands of Jews rescued in World War II. All that plus much more. Ask for your free copy at premierchristianity.com/free sample.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to the second part of today's edition of The Profile with me, Justin Brierley, where every week we sit down with an interesting Christian to talk about their walk of faith and life. Don't forget, you can find more interviews with leading Christians in our monthly magazine, Premier Christianity magazine, and you can ask for a free sample copy by going to the website, premierchristianity.com/free sample. And of course, you can find The Profile on its own podcast too. Just look for The Profile wherever you find your podcasts, or go to our website, premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. Well, today on the programme, I've been joined by Nigel Cameron, bioethics and future technology expert and author of a new book, The Robots Are Coming, Us, Them and God, which was recently published by CARE. Very much aimed at Christians, helping them to understand the issues, some of the opportunities and the challenges involved. And it's very much a study guide in a way. Every chapter ends with questions that could be asked, I suppose, in a small group setting or on an individual basis or in perhaps some sort of church discussion. What made you want to specifically produce this, which is a very accessible lay-level book on these issues around artificial intelligence and robotics, Nigel?
Well, I've been getting into the discussion specifically about the issue of robots and jobs. I mean, The Economist magazine flew me out to Hong Kong to speak about that at their Asia Investor Summit and some similar sorts of things in a purely secular context, because I've been tracking the way in which the whole robot job debate was going, and yet was not being given sufficient prominence. Political leaders and so on weren't taking this seriously. And so I'd been doing some writing and speaking about that. Off the back of that, because I mean most of my work is in a secular context, I began doing some thinking about, well, what really is the Christian conversation here, which is a much broader discussion. Of course, it isn't just about jobs. That's one small component of it. As we, we have this commission to go out and have dominion and all that, and our dominion is now ending up with us making machines which are increasingly like us. And what does all this mean? So I just explored around, did some reading, and thought, well, let's get it out there. I mean, it interests me that this hasn't been happening. I mean, there aren't dozens of books like this out there. I'd love it if there were. And in fact, I had an interesting experience recently with one of the top American Christian publishers. I know the guy who runs the thing, and I just sent it over to him and say, I mean, I hadn't thought much about this, but let's do an American edition. I'd have to revise some of it. And he read some of it and got a colleague to read some of it, and he said there just isn't a market in the Christian bookshop.
How interesting.
I mean, Christians don't really want to think about this stuff. So I'm making some waves.
That's so interesting that Christians just don't seem, because if you look at our culture, everybody seems to be talking about this. You know, the TV programs like Humans, Black Mirror, Westworld, they're all imagining a near future where we're increasingly engaging with very human-like advanced artificial intelligence and asking all kinds of interesting ethical questions through those programs about it. I mean, you bring up some of those in the book, obviously. Westworld is this, it's based on the 1970s novel and film by Michael Crichton, but it's an updating of that where people effectively go into a Western theme park stocked with these very advanced animatronic robots, but which are almost indistinguishable from humans and can do more or less anything they like to them, including killing them, having sex with them. And it raises all kinds of ethical questions around, well, is that what we want to be doing with our technology? What's your view in terms of the, let's call it, entertainment side that often does drive actually a lot of technological advance?
Well, I think it's fascinating that we've seen a whole series now of sort of popular mainstream movies, TV programs addressing these profound ethical questions. It isn't the church that's doing this. It's people out to make money out of broadcasting.
Yeah.
Michael Crichton's book's very interesting. It was the first movie he actually directed back in mid-70s, whenever it was, Westworld. And I remember watching it shortly after then. And I actually met Crichton is now dead, sadly. He died quite young. Very interesting man. I met him a number of times in the States, and he took part in some events we organised some years ago. Very, very thoughtful, enormously tall. He was about 6'7" or something. And he was a doctor. He was an MD from Harvard. Not a typical sort of, writer about this stuff. Very thoughtful man. And it fascinates me that Westworld has come back 30 years later as this very successful series exploring this stuff at a pretty fundamental level. I mean, what does it mean if you confront somebody who maybe is human, maybe is not? And does it mean you can just do what you like with them because they're just computers? What are you doing to yourself if you decide to chop them up or have sex with them or something like that? Because, of course, it isn't that they're made in the image of God, but they're made in the image of humans who are made in the image of God. Indeed. So this is not, I think, a simple thing. They're not just machines. They're machines that are doing moral things.
It sort of takes it a little bit beyond just sort of video games where you get to shoot people up, which has its own moral questions, in a sense. But this is when you're being presented with someone who, in principle, is indistinguishable from another human being, and you're saying, well, since they're effectively a robot, I can do what I like. There is that question of it may not harm the robot because the robot can't perhaps experience emotions or whatever, though all of that gets called into question, of course, in Westworld. But what does it do to us as humans when we start engaging with objects in that sort of way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much about us. I think the same when the discussions about animals and the treatment of animals are about us. Wilberforce was one of the founders of the RSPCA. Very interesting. He wasn't just freeing slaves. And one of his concerns was that if people do these things to their animals, they will do these things to their children. And that very much how we respond to other intelligent, sensitive creatures, even homemade creatures like robots, tells us a lot about ourselves. And this is one reason I think these issues are so interesting, but it makes them very complicated. And, of course, sad to say, I don't think Christians warm to complicated issues. We like simple issues. I like simple issues. It's right, it's wrong, euthanasia's wrong, simple as that. But what does it mean if you're confronting a humanoid robot?
Just sticking with the Hollywood side of this, you reference a number of films as well in the book that have addressed these issues. One that you come back to a few times is the film AI by Steven Spielberg. Do you want to just give us the premise of that film and the kinds of issues it raised about the differences between so-called Augur, or humans, and mecha, humanoid creatures, but that are still robotic?
Yeah, Spielberg's film, it's well worth a review 20 years or something later. In some ways, it was a pretty bad film. They put all the effort into the sort of Spielberg side of it, into all the effects. But the effects are very, very, they draw you in. I mean, the thing that I most remember about it is this scene of this country fair. The basic idea is that when people's robots go wrong, they throw them away. But they don't just sort of recycle them. They let them run off into the forests, and they live there sort of in their sort of rustic life on their own, all these oddly looking half-broken robots. And for entertainment purposes, people round them up and bring them into a sort of gladiatorial arena to fight and be destroyed. And, of course, the robot whom we've got to know is rounded up on one of these occasions, which draws us into this thing at this country fair. And so you see these robots basically being used as gladiatorial material to be killed for fun. And I found that really very, very disturbing, partly because they've all been given cute characters and so on, of course, in the film. But the notion that you create something very like yourself and then you use it in the very opposite way of the way that you believe you should ever treat yourself. I mean, the basic moral idea, I mean, summarized by Kant and so on, is that, humans have to be ends and not means. And that you should never ultimately use somebody else simply as something you use. It has to ultimately to be about them. And this, of course, completely inverts that when you produce creatures very like us and you use them as means, ultimately, as in Spielberg's film, just so that you can have fun looking at them being killed.
And this all sort of ties in to the sexual element of this. And as I say, if anywhere is sort of pushing the drive towards more and more realistic humanoid robots, it's actually the sex industry, where we are seeing now being marketed these sort of very realistic sex dolls, effectively high-tech sex dolls. And that in itself gives many people pause for thought. I sat down to speak, though, to David Levy recently, who is at the forefront of, advocating for the future of this sort of technology and believing it'll be good for people who struggle under normal circumstances to find a partner and that sort of thing. Where do you land on the idea of using robots effectively for that particular kind of purpose?
Well, I think you're back in the same position, it seems to me. And because going back to Westworld, the original Westworld, the cult movie, and then the series that many of us have now watched. I mean, there are two things going on here, really, in our treatment of these humanoid creatures. I mean, one is killing them, and the other one is having sex with them. And they both raise these fundamental questions of propriety about what this is doing to us. And the notion that you create a being which is made in the image of God, who's sort of second level resemblance of God, merely for your pleasure. I mean, it's the very opposite of a relationship, purely one-sided. And again, I'm not saying we should outlaw these things. We should round up people like David Levy and lock them up for the rest of their lives. I did make a rather throwaway comment during an interview a few months ago. Maybe we should put a 1,000% tax on these things, which would severely discourage their use, and this sort of hit the headlines briefly. Right. And I mean, maybe that wasn't such a bad idea. I mean, I think there are ways of discouraging things that don't necessarily involve criminalizing them.
Right, rather like we tax cigarettes and things like that, which we overall consider are bad for our health, but not bad enough that we would ban them. I mean, it does raise that. I mean, when I spoke to David Levy, I raised the issue which others have raised with him of well, in principle, it's possible that paedophiles could use childlike human sex robots and that sort of thing. Does he? And he was, frankly, his view seemed to be that if it's not human, it doesn't matter. And this might be some therapeutic value for someone with those kinds of inclinations.
I have seen him quoted as saying that, and I have never met David Levy, and he is obviously a man who is capable of contrived naivete. Because in Japan, they're already doing this. They're already producing, pedo sex toys like this. And the notion that this simply won't expand the market and that people who are using these toys aren't then going to want to try it out on real children, I think is extraordinarily naive. And certainly the notion we have this great experiment to see if that is what happens seems to me to be a very terrible thing. I mean, okay, it's one thing for people to be using sex toys in their private lives and using these big, fully automated sex robots. It's quite another thing to hazard the well-being of children. And the Japanese are already doing this. They don't seem to care much about these issues in the way that we do in the West. And I think Levy is really quite dishonest to be going around giving this kind of apology for what he's up to.
I mean, as you say, a lot of this is actually happening in the present day. This isn't necessarily all future stuff. I mean, one of the big issues that's been hitting the headlines recently is driverless cars. Now, that takes us out of sort of humanoid type of robots, but it's still very much a form of artificial intelligence where human functions are increasingly being replaced by machines, potentially doing a much better job than us. I mean, I think you say in the book that if once driverless cars become a general reality, and I think they probably will at some point, we'll see a lot less accidents because humans are so, inevitably we make errors so easily compared to robots. Nonetheless, it does raise ethical implications about when, on the rare occasion, a robot car does have to make a decision about whether it hits the child on the pavement or the pedestrian directly in front of them. We have to think through the ethical implications of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in fact, most people don't realize you buy a new car now, it's probably got 100 million lines of code built into it. You're buying a very complex computer which just happens to have wheels on it. I mean, this is very, very different to what cars were like 30 years ago, and this is now. Uber has ordered 24,000 self-driving cars from Volvo to be delivered next year. And Uber's new chief, who seems to be much more of a sensible guy than the Kalanick who ran Uber originally, he's talked about this, and he says they're going to try this in certain cities, and a small number of rides will be in, and this is very practical, and it's going to happen. This is now. I think in 5 years' time it'll be quite normal. I think in 10 years' time there'll probably be no cab drivers in cities anyway, and there'll be no lorry drivers on motorways. 10 years' time I think it'll be over, because the money is all one way. This is going to save a lot of money. It's going to save a lot of lives. And yes, there'll be accidents. The thing is, what's so funny about some of these issues of robots replacing people? We think we're good at everything. We're total generalists. Humans are terrible at most things. We're awful, awful drivers. It's a miracle we don't get killed every day we go out on the roads. Road casualties in the US, interestingly, have gone up by 25% in the last 5 years. Up to 40,000 deaths last year. This isn't even I haven't seen this anywhere in the press being taken seriously. And it's partly because I think it isn't people texting. I think it's the car manufacturers putting in these fancy screens. So you've got to play with screens to change the heating rather than dial knobs. But yes, these machines are coming. They're going to be an awful lot safer. And even though people now say, "Oh, I would be scared," people change their minds. And they will. But yes, presently, if you're driving along and there are leaves on the road and it's slippery and there's someone pulling out and crossing the road and there's a child and there's a dog and so on, and you end up in an accident and somebody gets killed, the police aren't going to sit down and work out why did you decide to go on the pavement and kill the child rather than go down the road and kill the woman with the dog. It's regarded as an accident. You do something instinctive. There's no examination of this. If it's a self-driving vehicle, someone has thought this through. And probably some 22-year-old geek has been sitting around writing the code and making a decision about exactly what the car will do in this very particular circumstance. And one of the problems with the fact that we in general, and the church in particular, have not been leading this conversation is that these people are operating on the advice of corporate decision makers and company lawyers who are saying this is the safest thing for us to have decided, rather than people like us saying, well, what is the human life question that should drive, if you like, the way in which we have accidents?
Let's talk about some of the stuff that is more still in the realm of sci-fi, though, at this point. And you talk at some length in the book about Ray Kurzweil, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who in many ways has been a long-standing person talking about artificial intelligence. Now, he has predicted something for 2045. What is this thing, and do you think it's a reality in the way Ray Kurzweil obviously thinks it is?
Well, yes, this is what Kurzweil calls the singularity. Singularity is a word that can have various meanings, and in a sci-fi story about 30 years ago, a sci-fi writer wrote about it having this particular meaning, and it being the point at which artificial intelligence takes off and becomes smarter than we are altogether, and therefore is going to run everything. And if you imagine this as a curve, Moore's law, the idea basically that computer chips get smarter and cheaper all the time and so on, as a sort of curve going up and up and up, finally it goes vertical.
It's exponential growth.
It's an exponential growth, and finally the factor becomes vertical or near vertical, and you can't predict what's going to happen next because it's a kind of explosion of intelligence. And we're kind of hanging on by the seat of our pants and hoping we still have a place in this new world which will result. And Kurzweil's been peddling this for a long time. His deadlines have moved on progressively, a bit like some sects predicting the end of the world. It doesn't happen this. So, it really is 10 years' time. And I think one way to look at Kurzweil's work is see it as a kind of secular religion. which he goes around peddling. And I mean, he is making some good points about the exponential development of these technologies. A lot of smart people fundamentally disagree with him. I mean, I remember seeing him having a debate with a professor of biology from Cambridge. And Kurzweil was saying, well, every year, the computer technology gets closer and closer to the workings of the brain. And the professor said, actually, Dr. Kurzweil, he said, not quite simple as that, because every year we discover we know less about how the brain actually works. So you just can't do this with it. And I mean, that's the kind of problem. But there's no question this stuff is getting faster. I mean, little facts like, what is it, since the 1950s, our computing capacity has increased by a factor of, not 10, but 1 trillion.
Right.
And so if you project 30 years' time, another trillion, we've no idea what that means.
But while Kurzweil is somewhat enthusiastic about this super intelligence, and there are others, leading people in these technological fields, Bill Gates, Elon Musk from Tesla, and several others, who are very concerned, it would appear. They really think actually we're heading into an unknown, and we really need to be much better prepared about what that could. Now, do you kind of share their kind of concerns about where we would go if we did reach some kind of tipping point of a singularity?
I certainly share their concerns. I'm not sure whether they're positing this on the singularity idea, but you don't need to. You just need to posit it on AI becoming more and more powerful, and things would go wrong. And you can get rogue developments which are unexpected, or you can get deliberate rogue developments. Of course, at heart, technology is all about giving one person more power over other people. And these technologies give small number of people enormous power over other people. So whether it's deliberately being exercised, or whether there are accidents, whether things, if you like having a bug escape from the lab, things would go seriously wrong. And so Gates and Musk and others and Stephen Hawking have, they signed this letter a couple of years ago saying that we need to worry about this. And they put some money into this. And there's a research centre at Cambridge which is working on this, and there are some others. And, of course, now we have a House of Lords Select Committee looking at some of these things. And I think this is very, very good. And I really hope that the Church begins to take a lead in shaping these conversations, because, these are very risky things. And it isn't, the debate isn't between the Luddites who want to close it all down and people like Kurzweil who want to party all night because it's all wonderful. The real debate is in the middle ground, and that's where I think Christians should be.
Speaking of religion, and there was a story last year. Tech pioneer Anthony Lewandowski had filed papers for the creation of a new AI religion with the purpose of the realization, acceptance, and worship of a godhead based on artificial intelligence developed through computer hardware and software. Now, I'm not sure if this was more a gimmick than anything, but do you take that sort of thing seriously? The idea that we could even have a sort of a religious sort of devotion almost to AI and its possibilities?
Well, I think that is the default religion of much of Silicon Valley. And it's a wonderfully profitable religion for them at the moment. That wouldn't surprise me. One could be cynical. There are probably tax advantages in the US to having things framed as religions. But there's something quite mysterious here, and something which is much more complex than what the people actually controlling it understand. One of the problems with the Wall Street collapse 10 years ago was that they were writing programs that no one actually understood, which were then doing things that they weren't expected to be doing. And that was 10 years ago, and we've come a long way since then technically. And there's something very mysterious at work here. And I think we need to recognize that, those of us who are believers, that this is a mystery which is unfolding in the midst of God's creation. He's given us these capacities. And just like, we end up inventing nuclear power, and we can explode nuclear bombs. We can develop, pathogens which could destroy every creature on the planet. This is all the downside of the nuclear power and being able to cure diseases. So with AI, we're letting loose. And, Musk himself, and I quote this in the book, he says, are we letting loose the demon? And I think it is a question we have to keep at the back of our minds. And here we have a secular man saying, we're letting loose a demon. And I would love to have Christians begin to think in those terms too.
And I think that a big question for Christians as well as secular people is if it were in principle possible to create consciousness or something indistinguishable from what we regard as a truly human characteristic, the ability to reason, to be creative, to hold values, to experience emotion. If we were able to create that in a machine, would we want to? Because that almost does take us into the point of view where, from a Christian perspective, we are literally playing God. If that is something that we believe is uniquely bestowed upon humans, this level of consciousness that we have, are we in any way or shape capable or responsible enough to endow it through our own abilities on machines?
Well, a couple of comments. I mean, one is that I'm not an enthusiast for the term playing God. I was once involved with a project, a sort of multimedia project, which used that as its name, and I went along with it and so on. But I thought about it afterwards. I think it's a confusing term, because I think God wants us to play along with Him, in creating stuff, and the whole Dominion mandate is all about doing stuff here, using the skills He's given us. The question is whether we do this in a way which sort of pokes a finger in His eye, and spits at Him, which is what sinful nature would lead us to do. And this can be the case with very primitive technologies. It doesn't just involve fancy technologies. But more generally, and I mean, maybe I'm sure not everyone's going to agree with this, but we may plainly create, if we create Westworld type, semi-intelligent, apparently intelligent, walking, breathing, ticking sort of, mechanical humanoids, which is entirely plausible. And you haven't got to have some great breakthrough to do that. I mean, a lot of these technologies are in place. And certainly the sex robot stuff is advancing along one particular path there. I think there are a lot of parallels with what we're discovering about animals. And again, this is a point that I make in the book. And I'm quite interested in the question of animal intelligence. I don't know much about it, but I've been looking at it much more as I thought about machines. And, some scientists think that sperm whales may be smarter than humans. But they haven't got opposable thumbs, and there is great slabs floating around the oceans, living maybe 200 years or something. But what can they do? I mean, they can't make machines and go to the moon and so on. But they maybe have it all up there. And I have no problem. I mean, I'm very interested in, the animal rights people, I think, have it wrong. I think they want animals to have rights like humans do. But I have no difficulty with the idea that we should acknowledge that in some of the higher animals, as in some of the machines we may create, we develop something which is a kind of analogy to human rights and human dignity, which requires of us a particular kind of respect, which is of a fundamental character, so that you do not treat an orangutan, as if it were a chicken, because there's a far higher level of intelligence there. Certainly, you would treat it as if it were a corn stick. I mean, there's a different kind of thing. And that we should be more candid and open to doing that, not be worried about the sort of animal rights extremists claiming us as their followers. And I think the same thing may well apply as we develop more intelligent machines, that we have a kind of analogical, or if you like, second-order respect for them. And if you want to talk about rights and dignity, you can, as long as you frame it that way. And the key point being, from a Christian perspective, this is precisely because they share in those things which we have as those who bear the image of God. This isn't a kind of rivalry or replication of it. And of course, the same issue, I touched on this again, is life on other planets. And, we just this week now discovered apparently Earth-like planets in another in another galaxy. Which is an incredible thing what they can do with radio telescopes. But we've now found scads of Earth-like planets within our own galaxy. And there may well be life on some of them. I mean, C.S. Lewis, of course, wrote his marvellous Perelandra and so on about, and this may well be the case. There may well be other creatures out there. And this is going to cause our theologians to have quite a stew. I mean, they're going to get migraines over this. But, I mean, God may well have done this. And how will we handle those kinds of intelligence? Little green men from, not Mars, but I mean from some Mars and some other solar system. So I think our notions of human, and the uniqueness of human dignity, uniqueness of our bearing the image of God, I think there needs to be an openness to the development of, and perhaps the discovery of, other intelligences.
As a good Presbyterian, you'll know that one of the things that were given as a responsibility for humans in the garden was the work, was to subdue the earth, was to be part, as you say, playing with God in this act of creation. And part of that is our natural propensity to work. Now, this is, again, one of the major concerns you have in the book, and you've written about it elsewhere as well, is the way that robotics inevitably is a technological revolution that will have implications for jobs, for people, for all the kinds of roles that people currently do, manual roles especially, which can easily be done far more cheaply by robotic labour. I mean, that's happened in all kinds of industries already in various ways. But you genuinely take seriously the possibility that we may see much, much more unemployment in the future because of the way that robotics and AI is going?
I think a prudent person looking ahead will plan for the serious possibility of lower levels of employment. I mean, we've had this thing called full employment, which isn't a technical term really. It just means that most people who want jobs can get them. And new unemployment, going between 3 and 4%, 10% and so on, goes up and down with the economic cycle. But I mean, this has been the case for a long time. We've been very lucky. It isn't a natural order of things. A lot of it involves manipulation by central banks and governments and so on. And this is a situation that may not continue. And I think prudent governments, and I've talked to people in government about this in several countries over the last 2 or 3 years. I said, you need to have a plan for when, instead of around 5% unemployment, you're talking of around 30% or around 50%. What's going to happen then? And I think in practical terms, this means social policy issues need to be re-examined. The distinctions we have between being retired and working, between full-time, part-time, charity work, paid work, student work, all of these distinctions have been set up in a situation where you have a full-time job or you don't have a full-time job. I see just this morning, I just read the headline that Theresa May's government is looking into having some sort of new deal for gig workers, part-time workers, giving them rights and so on. That's the sort of conversation to have, although it tends to be a conversation about how to make this operate like they had real full-time jobs in the old economy. The old economy is not going to be there in 20 and 30 years' time. Second comment would be that John Maynard Keynes, who was the greatest economist of the 20th century, rather delightfully cultured, somewhat eccentric Englishman, wrote an essay toward the end of his life called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, where he's looking ahead. And he talks about, he comes up with the phrase technological unemployment. I think it was his phrase. And he sees a time when maybe we'll only need to work 15 hours a week. He talks in a wonderfully ironic way about what he calls a new leisured class. Because this was the days of P.G. Wodehouse and gentlemen and so on who didn't need to work. But a new leisured class, by which, of course, he means widespread unemployment of people who don't need to work because they can't work. And I think we at least need to plan for these possibilities. And I did a TEDx speech down in Brazil 3 or 4 years ago. Very interesting trip, partly because I was just completely zonked from jet lag when I made my speech. But it's up there and it worked. And I tell you, it's meant to be 18 minutes, these things. It was 18 minutes and 1 second. I was very proud of it.
Wow, well done.
But I said it's heaven or hell.
Yes.
And this could be heaven if we only had to work 15 hours a week. And we could do cultural things, family things, church things, occupy our time in other ways. Hell, if basically we were all, quote, unemployed, unquote, living on the dole, and we spend a lot of time watching television and eating McDonald's.
Right. And
which way does this go? And the church should be leading.
Absolutely. I think one of the issues, you sort of very interestingly paint two ideas of two possible speeches of prime ministers in 2040, reflecting on widespread changes in society because of the advancement of robotics in all areas of employment, and one in which is all pro the future of robotics and the fact that we need to now be making certain provisions to make sure that people who don't have a job are sort of given enough basic income and that sort of thing, and so on. But then another, which is a more nihilistic version, where there's obviously been mass rioting and all kinds of social upheaval going on, in which the primacy of humans over robots is always kept at the forefront, and that we must put technology in its place, and always humans must come first, and we're going to stop creating humanoid-like robots and all that sort of thing. So which of those two futures do you think is the most likely? The one where we just accept that the future is robotics and we're going to sort of become possibly the leisured class, who knows, maybe this sort of this binge TV watching class, who knows, or the one where we say enough is enough, we've got to come first, and we humans are special in a way that we have to make sure the robots don't take our place in that way?
Well, I think there are sort of little sort of sprigs of green in this situation. I think there are signs people are thinking about the human questions. Just in the last day or two, there's been an announcement of a new project out in Silicon Valley called the Center for Humane Technology. And it's being run by a lot of people who used to work for Facebook and Google in the early days. And they've seen the error of their ways. And they've come out swinging, saying this stuff is destroying us. It's destroying all the things that are important to us in our society. Destroying our attention, our relationships, thinning out our entire experience. And so they're putting a lot of their ill-gotten gains from their stock options, into pushing back and doing some fresh thinking and doing lobbying and doing education with schools. I think there are signs that, people, the famous quote, what was it? Was it the man who founded Napster, Sean Parker, the other day, came out because he was the first president of Facebook. He was president of Facebook in the early days with Zuckerberg. And he says, God knows what this stuff is doing with our brains. And so I think this is very healthy. People are rethinking. People who are from that community. This isn't just classic Luddites from the radical left. These are high-tech people. And they've begun to realize, partly because they have kids. The guy who runs Google was just saying the other day, who runs Apple was just saying the other day that he won't let his nephew use social media. This is Mr. Apple.
And he knows social media back to front.
They know too much. And it'll be interesting to see when the Zuckerberg kids grow up. Mark Zuckerberg has 2 small children. Just what exactly they do with them. Because, Facebook's just launched this thing for 6-year-olds. Messenger for kids. To get 6-year-olds. And the reason they've launched it is because their teenage numbers are going down a bit. So, of course, they come up with all of this guff about the fact that small children need to talk to their parents at work. This is all about making money by getting their eyeballs when they're 6 years old. Well, when Zuckerberg's kids are 6, I wonder whether they'll. So, I think there are signs of rethinking going on in the next generation. So maybe I'm a bit hopeful.
And as a Christian, overall, where do you find yourself, concerned or confident for the future?
As a Christian, well, we're in the hands of God, and the world has gone through terrible things, and God seems to have a plan in which that's part of the deal. So I think we can't claim that God will somehow save us from the worst consequences of human sin now any more than he did, during the Holocaust and all the 30 Years' War and the other wicked experiences we've been through. At the same time, I think there are certainly signs of hope that smart people are thinking ahead and can see the dramatic nature of these changes. I could wish more of these people were Christians. But I'm very glad that they're concerned for many of the values that are also of concern to us. For family values, for humane values, for the dignity of the individual, for privacy. These are very much Christian concerns. And maybe it's going to be the pagans who end up saving us, as they have in the past, from our worst inclinations. But I think there's an opportunity for Christian leaders to take the helm here, because we've thought about what it means to be human. We accept that God has given us these technologies, and we want to be responsible. Let's work out how to do that.
Thank you so much for joining me for a fascinating conversation on The Profile today, Nigel.
Great to be here.
It's been great to have you. Nigel Cameron, you can find out more about him. His new book, The Robots Are Coming, Us, Them and God, is published by Care. And do check out this edition of the programme as well online. Share it with your friends. premierchristianradio.com/The Profile, or find it in its own podcast as well. And don't forget, you can find more interviews with leading Christians in all walks of life via our partner, Premier Christianity magazine. Go and ask for a free sample copy, premierchristianity.com/free sample. For now, I've been Justin Brierley, your host for The Profile this week, handing over to find out what's been happening on Premier in the last 7 days in Premier Playback coming up next.